it must have been a couple months ago, I'm not sure, when Anne got in touch with me and said, would you be willing to speak at one of our evenings, one of our Shakespeare evenings? And I said, sure, be happy to. I've been meaning to do this for a very long time. Circumstances have always seemed to get in the way. I said, what would you like me to speak about? And she said, well, we just did Macbeth, and we're about to do Much Ado About Nothing. Can you just do something about those two plays? And I'm thinking, I couldn't imagine two plays that have less in common with each other than Macbeth and Much Ado About Nothing. On the one hand, we have a play, Macbeth, which is the, progenitor of the psychological thriller, of the slasher picks that have become such a part of our culture. And on the other hand, in Much Ado About Nothing, we have the origins of the rom-com, the sparring couple that thinks that they hate each other and comes to realize that they actually love each other. What might these two plays possibly have in common? What is the crossover point? One is a tragedy, maybe the archetypal tragedy in Shakespeare. The other is a boisterous, uplifting, joyous comedy. So I was mulling over it for a while, hanging out with my friend Jack Daniels, and I had a kind of epiphany. I realized the one thing that these two plays have in common is that in both plays, in each play, the leading lady asks the leading man to kill somebody. And that seemed very curious to me. And that makes sense in the context of Macbeth, the Scottish play. But when you think about that in the context of Much Ado About Nothing, it seems very strange indeed. And so I'm going to speak, I'm going to kind of half read or so just to track my thoughts here about that unusual circumstance and what that reveals to us about tragedy, about comedy, about Shakespeare, maybe about ourselves. So I do want to thank you for letting me be here. It's not every day I get to stand on a stage with a drum set behind me and lights in my full-on Shakespeare gear, so thank you. I want to start with a kind of just to remind everybody, refresh everybody, what happens in the Scottish play in Macbeth. I know most of you who are here probably saw the latest production, but maybe not everybody did, and I want to make sure we have that clearly in mind. Now, Macbeth tells a story of a Scottish nobleman who meets three witches on a heath. They prophesy that he will become king. At first, this prophecy seems impossible, but when part of it comes true, Macbeth begins to imagine the possibility that this may in fact happen. He writes to his wife, Lady Macbeth. She seizes on the possibility immediately. When the king, the sitting king, Duncan, visits their home, she urges Macbeth to murder him and take the crown. Macbeth hesitates, but under pressure, he commits the crime. From that moment forward, the play becomes what we might not now recognize, as I said earlier, the first great psychological thriller. The action is not driven merely by events, but by the unraveling of Macbeth's mind. He begins to see things, daggers in the air, ghosts at a table. He becomes paranoid, violent, increasingly isolated. Each crime demands another. Each act meant to secure his power only deepens his insecurity. Meanwhile, Lady Macbeth, who had seemed so strong, begins to collapse inward, haunted by guilt, sleepwalking through the night, trying to wash imagined blood from her hands. The play ends as tragedies do in death. Macbeth is killed, order is restored, but at immense human cost. Much Ado About Nothing, by contrast, unfolds not in the dark, gloomy recesses of Scotland, but in the sunlit world of Messina in Italy. Soldiers are returning from a war, and with them comes the swirl of social life, courtship, conversation, flirtation. There are two central couples in this play. First, Claudio and Hero. These are young, idealistic. They quickly fall in love. They're almost cardboard cutouts of the young lovers. Second is Benedict and Beatrice. They are a little bit older. They are sharper, seasoned, and they have been locked in a war of wit for as long as anybody can remember. They mock marriage. They mock each other. They insist that they will never fall in love. But we obviously know where this is going. And yet, through a series of comic deceptions, each is led to believe that the other harbors secret affection. And so begins one of the earliest and most enduring forms of storytelling we now recognize everywhere, the romantic comedy, where opposites attract, where those who seem to dislike one another most deeply are, in fact, most suited to one another. But this play is not without its own darkness. A villain, Don John, who's here tonight, be careful. Don John deceives Claudio into thinking that Hero has been unfaithful. At the altar, Claudio publicly shames her. She collapses. Her family pretends she has died. At this moment, the comedy teeters on the edge of tragedy. Beatrice, to test Benedict's newly declared love for her, turns to him and demands that he avenge her cousin's slander and her death. Kill Claudio, she demands of him. And for a moment, we are in a different play. But the truth about Hero emerges, the deception is exposed, Hero is revealed to be alive and innocent, Claudio repents, the play ends as comedies do, in reconciliation and marriage. Indeed, in multiple marriages. Before we move further, let me pause on something that may seem small, but is, I think, deeply revealing. Consider the titles of Shakespeare's plays. I'll read some of the tragedies to you. Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet. Now compare those plays to a list of titles of the comedies. Much Ado About Nothing, As You Like It, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night. The difference should start to become evident to you. The tragedies all focused intensely on a single person or a couple, while the comedies evoke a community at large. They don't point to a single figure. They evoke a situation, a mood, a world. What does this suggest? In tragedy, we see as the plays progress, the focus narrows. Everything converges on a single individual or an ill-fated couple whose choices shape and ultimately destroy the world around them. In comedy, rather than narrowing, the focus widens. The individual is still important, but he or she is embedded within a larger social fabric, a community that can absorb error, correct misjudgment, and restore order. Tragedy is about the fate of individuals. Comedy is about the life of a community. And this difference will help us to understand everything that follows in the two plays we're looking at tonight. If we step back for a moment, we can begin with the most familiar distinction we inherit about Shakespeare. Tragedies end in death, comedies end in marriage. That is true, but in a sense it is also superficial, because what matters more than the ending is the movement, the direction of the human soul over the course of the play. What kind of world are we entering? What kind of transformation is taking shape? And what happens to the bonds between people along the way? In Macbeth, we enter a world already trembling with instability. The air is thick with suggestion, with prophecy, with the sense that something is about to break. And at the center of this world is not simply a man, but a marriage. Macbeth and his wife begin as partners, intellectually, emotionally, even spiritually aligned. He writes to her not as a distant spouse, but as his, quote, dearest partner of greatness. There is something compelling, even admirable, in that unity. But what that unity is ordered toward becomes the decisive question. When Macbeth hesitates before the murder of Duncan, it is not his enemies who push him to go and kill the king It is his wife. And she does this not merely by urging him to act, but by reshaping his sense of himself, his identity, his masculinity, his worth. When he hesitates, calling on the fact that this person is a guest in his home, that the king is somebody he owes allegiance to, who's just rewarded him for his service, she looks him in the eye and says, "When you durst do it, then you were a man." In that moment, marriage becomes a kind of moral accelerator. It intensifies desire. It removes hesitation. It closes off alternative paths. And Macbeth acts. What follows is not simply a sequence of crimes, it is the progressive narrowing of the human world. Each act of violence cuts Macbeth off further from others, from reality, even from himself. The marriage that once united him with another becomes increasingly silent, fractured, and distant. By the end, when he hears of his wife's death, the response is not grief in any ordinary sense, but a kind of hollow recognition that nothing remains to be felt. Life is but a walking shadow, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. This is tragedy, not simply because people die, but because meaning itself seems to die with them. The world contracts, the self collapses inward, and what began as a bond becomes a tomb. Now place this alongside the world of Much Ado About Nothing. Here too we begin with instability, but of a different kind. Not prophecy, but rumor. Not ambition, but misunderstanding. The setting is not a blasted heath, but a lively household, full of conversation, wit, and social exchange. And again, at the center, we find a pair. But Beatrice and Benedict do not begin in unity. They begin in opposition, sparring, mocking, protecting themselves through language. Each has made a kind of quiet vow not to be vulnerable, not to be taken in by love. And so their early exchanges are marked by brilliance, but also by evasion. Wit becomes a shield. Language becomes a way of keeping the world at bay. But then something curious happens. Through a series of playful deceptions, friends staging conversations meant to be overheard, each of these two is led to believe that the other one is in love with them. And instead of a deepening illusion, this deception begins to dissolve that illusion. They begin to see themselves differently. They begin tentatively to move toward one another. And yet, just as this movement begins, as the moment when they finally admit their love for one another, the play darkens. Hero is slandered. Claudio, convinced of her betrayal, publicly shames her. She collapses. Her family declares her dead. And in that moment, the comedy trembles on the edge of becoming something else entirely. Beatrice turns to Benedict and utters one of the most startling lines in Shakespeare: "Kill Claudia." And suddenly we are very close to Macbeth. Once again, a woman calls a man to violence. Once again, masculinity, honor, and action are bound together in a single demand. But this time, something different happens. Benedict does not rush forward. He does not collapse and give in to the demand. He pauses. He reflects. He remains crucially within a web of relationships. He's still capable of judgment, still open to correction, still situated within a moral world larger than his own impulse. He does act. He challenges Claudio to a duel, but the action does not spiral into bloodshed. Instead, the truth begins to emerge, the deception is uncovered, Hero is revealed to be alive and innocent, Claudio repents. And the play moves slowly then decisively back towards resolution and restoration, toward marriage, toward community, toward music and dance. What then is the difference. It's not that one world contains darkness and the other does not. Both worlds contain jealousy, deception, wounded honor, and the possibility of violence. The difference lies in what we allow those elements to become, how we allow them to take hold of us or not. In Macbeth, deception turns inwards. It isolates, it fragments reality. Language itself becomes unstable. Words no longer correspond to truth, and the world dissolves into ambiguity and fear. In Much Ado, deception, strangely, becomes a path towards truth. The very devices that mislead also reveal. Language, which had been a form of evasion, becomes a vehicle for sincerity, for confession, reconciliation, and vows. Even the question of honor, so central to both plays, takes on a different shape. For Macbeth, honor becomes indistinguishable from domination, from the assertion of will, from the willingness to act without restraint. For Benedict, honor is tested, but ultimately redefined. It becomes not the assertion of self over others, but the alignment of self with what is true, with loyalty, and with love. And so we begin to see that tragedy and comedy are not simply about different endings, but about different moral trajectories. In tragedy, the self turns inward, isolates itself, and ultimately collapses. In comedy, the self opens outward, risks transformation, and is restored. And this brings us back finally to where we began, with marriage. In Macbeth, marriage is a closed system, a feedback loop of ambition and fear cut off from the world, intensifying itself until it consumes both partners. In Much Ado About Nothing, marriage becomes the opposite. It is a reintegration into the world, a restoration of trust, a beginning rather than an end. And perhaps this is what Shakespeare is ultimately showing us, that human life always contains the seeds of both tragedy and comedy. The same impulses, the desire for recognition, for honor, for love, for meaning, can lead us in radically different directions. The difference lies not in the absence of darkness, but in what we do with that darkness. Whether we allow it to isolate us or in searching for light to deepen our bonds. Whether we turn inward towards sound and fury, signifying nothing, or outward towards the difficult, fragile, and ultimately redemptive work of being in relation to others. And in that space, in that moment between impulse and action, we find the narrow but decisive line between tragedy and comedy. Thank you.